They were told Americans would burn their villages, rape their daughters, and torture prisoners to death. But when four elderly Japanese women collapsed on a jungle path in Okinawa, May 1945, expecting American soldiers to finish what starvation had started, something impossible happened. The enemy did not shoot them. They did not leave them to die. Instead, 12 young Marines dropped their rifles, fashioned stretchers from bamboo and jackets, and carried these grandmothers 12 miles through enemy territory to save their lives. The women expected death. They received mercy. And in those 12 miles, everything they had been taught about monsters crumbled beneath the weight of unexpected humanity. If you are interested in untold stories from World War II that reveal the humanity behind the headlines, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. These forgotten moments of compassion deserve to be remembered. The morning sun beat down on southern Okinawa with merciless intensity. It was May 23rd, 1945, and the island had become a landscape of horrors. The Battle of Okinawa had raged for nearly 2 months, turning lush green hills into muddy craters and peaceful villages into smoking ruins. Civilians caught between two massive armies had fled into the island's interior, hiding in caves, abandoned buildings, and dense jungle. On a narrow dirt path cutting through thick vegetation, 4 elderly women struggled forward. Their traditional kimono were torn and mud-stained, the fabric hanging loose on frames that had grown skeletal. Nakamura Sato, at 68 the eldest, leaned heavily on a walking stick fashioned from a broken branch. Beside her, 64-year-old Tanaka Hana clutched her granddaughter's photo, the paper creased and water-damaged but still precious. Yoshida Keiko, 62, and Shimizu Yuki, 59, supported each other as they walked, their bare feet bleeding from cuts and blisters. These were not soldiers. They were grandmothers, wives, mothers who had spent their lives tending rice fields, raising children, and maintaining small village shrines. War had seemed like something distant, something that happened to other people in other places. But war had found them anyway. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decay. Smoke from distant artillery fire drifted through the trees, mixing with the scent of rotting vegetation and something worse that none of them wanted to name. Explosions rumbled in the distance like continuous thunder, sometimes close enough to make the ground tremble beneath their feet. The sound of American aircraft engines droned overhead, a constant reminder that death could fall from the sky at any moment. Nakamura's stomach cramped with hunger so fierce it had moved beyond pain into a dull, constant ache. They had eaten nothing but a handful of wild roots in 3 days. The roots had made Shimizu violently sick, leaving her weakened and dehydrated. Water was almost as scarce as food. The streams they passed were often contaminated with debris or the aftermath of battle. The heat pressed down on them like a physical weight. Sweat soaked through their already filthy clothing, attracting flies that buzzed around them in persistent clouds. Nakamura felt her vision swimming, dark spots appearing at the edges of her sight. Her legs trembled with each step. Beside her, Tanaka swayed dangerously, catching herself at the last moment before falling. "We cannot go much further," Yoshida whispered, her voice barely audible. Speaking took energy they did not have. Nakamura nodded, unable to disagree. They had been walking for hours, trying to reach a cave system where other villagers were said to be hiding, but the 12 miles might as well have been 100. Her body was giving up, shutting down one system at a time. "Perhaps it is time," Tanaka said softly, clutching her granddaughter's photograph tighter. "Perhaps we should rest here and let the spirits take us." The others understood what she meant. They had all heard the stories, the warnings broadcast by Japanese military officials and spread through terrified whispers. The Americans were coming, and when they arrived, they would show no mercy. Women would be violated and murdered. The elderly would be shot like animals or left to starve. Better to die with dignity than face such horrors. Some families had already made their terrible choice. Nakamura herself had seen it, a mother and her 3 children lying peacefully in a cave, empty poison bottles beside them. The image haunted her dreams when exhaustion finally forced her to sleep. The women found a spot beneath a large banyan tree where the shade offered slight relief from the brutal sun. They sank to the ground, too exhausted even to arrange themselves comfortably. Shimizu was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Yoshida tried to wet her lips with a few drops of precious water from their nearly empty canteen, but Shimizu did not respond. "I am sorry I brought you this far," Nakamura said, her voice breaking. "I thought we could reach safety. I thought there was still hope." Tanaka reached out and squeezed her hand. "You gave us hope when we had none. You made us keep trying. That is not something to apologize for." They sat in silence, listening to the distant sounds of war, waiting for the end. Time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. Minutes felt like hours, and yet their remaining time felt terribly short. Then they heard voices. American voices. The sound made Nakamura's blood turn cold. This was it. The moment they had been warned about. The Americans had found them. Wait, what happened next would shatter everything they believed about their enemy. A Marine patrol from the 6th Marine Division was moving cautiously through the jungle, weapons ready, eyes scanning for any sign of enemy soldiers. The patrol consisted of 12 men, most of them barely out of their teens. They had been fighting on Okinawa for 6 brutal weeks, had seen friends die, had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Corporal James Mitchell, a 22-year-old farm boy from Iowa, was on point. He had been trained to spot ambushes, to identify threats, to react instantly when danger appeared. So when he saw movement beneath the banyan tree, his rifle came up automatically, his finger moving to the trigger. Then he saw what the movement actually was. 4 elderly women, huddled together, looking up at him with eyes that held no hope, only acceptance of death. They were not soldiers. They were not armed. They were grandmothers, and they were dying. Mitchell held up his fist, signaling the patrol to stop. The other Marines froze, weapons raised, waiting for orders. Sergeant Thomas O'Brien moved up beside Mitchell, his eyes taking in the scene. "Jesus," O'Brien breathed, "they are in bad shape." The women stared at the Americans with expressions of pure terror. Nakamura tried to bow, a gesture of respect even in the face of expected execution. Her body would not cooperate. She managed only a slight nod before exhaustion pulled her back down. "They think we are going to kill them," Private Bobby Chen said quietly. Chen was Chinese-American, and while he could not speak Japanese, he recognized the look in their eyes. He had seen it before, in villages they had liberated, in civilians caught in the crossfire. O'Brien lowered his rifle and held up both hands in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture. "We are not going to hurt you," he said slowly, knowing they probably could not understand his words, but hoping his tone would convey meaning. The women did not move. They had no reason to believe him. Everything they had been told, every warning they had received, said that this moment would end in violence and death. Sergeant O'Brien had a decision to make, and he had to make it quickly. The patrol was supposed to be scouting enemy positions, not rendering aid to civilians. They were in hostile territory, exposed, vulnerable to ambush or artillery fire. Every minute they delayed put his men at risk. He looked at the 4 women again. One of them, Shimizu, was clearly unconscious or very close to it. The others were not much better. If his patrol moved on, these women would die here. There was no question about that. O'Brien thought about his own grandmother back in Boston, a tough Irish woman who had raised him after his parents died. He thought about the propaganda he had heard, the descriptions of Japanese as inhuman monsters who deserved no mercy. Then he looked at these 4 scared, starving old women and saw only human beings in desperate need. "Mitchell, Chen, break out the medical supplies," O'Brien ordered. "Davis, Thompson, see if we can find any clean water nearby. The rest of you establish a perimeter. We have got 4 civilians who need help." Private John Davis hesitated. "Sarge, we are supposed to be back at the rally point in an hour. If we stop here—" "Then we will be late," O'Brien cut him off. "I am not leaving these women to die. Anyone have a problem with that?" The Marines looked at each other. Some were uncomfortable with the decision. They had been fighting Japanese soldiers who had shown no mercy, who had committed atrocities, who had fought with suicidal desperation. It was hard to separate those enemies from these helpless civilians, but none of them could bring themselves to argue for leaving. These were somebody's grandmothers. If the war had taught them anything, it was that civilians always suffered most. "No problem, Sarge," Mitchell said, moving forward slowly with his hands visible, trying not to frighten the women further. The Marines approached carefully, moving slowly, speaking in quiet tones. Mitchell knelt a few feet away from Nakamura, setting his rifle aside and opening his medical kit. The gesture, putting down his weapon, seemed to register with the women. Nakamura's eyes widened slightly. Mitchell held up a canteen, unscrewing the cap and taking a small drink himself to show it was safe. Then he offered it to Nakamura. She stared at the canteen, at the young American's face, unable to comprehend what was happening. This was not death. This was not violence. This was kindness, and it made no sense. Slowly, hand trembling, Nakamura reached for the canteen. The first sip of clean water was like a miracle. She had not realized how desperately dehydrated she was until that moment. She drank too quickly, started to choke, and Mitchell gently took the canteen back, making calming gestures. "Slow," he said. "Drink slow. There's plenty." Chen was working on Shimizu, checking her pulse, her breathing, her level of consciousness. "This one is in really bad shape," he called to O'Brien. "Severe dehydration, malnutrition, probably other complications. She needs a hospital, not a field kit." "How far to the aid station?" O'Brien asked. Davis checked his map. "About 12 miles, Sarge. Through rough terrain, possibly enemy-occupied." O'Brien nodded slowly, the implications sinking in. 12 miles with 4 civilians who could barely walk. In combat conditions. It would take hours, would put his entire patrol at risk, would likely get them all in trouble with command. He looked at the 4 women again. At Shimizu, unconscious and possibly dying. At the others, watching the Americans with confused hope beginning to replace terror. At Mitchell, carefully helping Nakamura drink water, treating her with the same gentle respect he probably showed his own grandmother. All right, O'Brien said. We are taking them with us. Mitchell, Chen, Thompson, Wilson, you four make stretchers. Use bamboo poles and jackets. Davis, you are on point. Rodriguez, you take rear guard. We are going to move slow and careful. If we hit trouble, protecting these civilians is the priority. Everyone clear? Clear, Sarge, the Marines responded, already moving to follow orders. The women watched in astonishment as the Americans cut bamboo poles and fashioned stretchers, removing their own jackets to create sturdy carriers. Tanaka whispered to Nakamura, "What are they doing? Why are they helping us?" Nakamura shook her head, tears running down her weathered cheeks. "I do not know. Nothing makes sense anymore." When the stretchers were ready, the Marines helped the women onto them with surprising gentleness. Shimizu was placed on the first stretcher, still unconscious. The other three were helped to their feet, and when it became clear they could not walk far, 2 more stretchers were quickly constructed. Private Tommy Wilson, a 19-year-old from Tennessee, helped Yoshida onto a stretcher. She looked up at his young face, saw the care in his eyes, and something broke inside her. She started crying, not from fear but from the overwhelming confusion of being treated with compassion by the people she had been taught were demons. Wilson did not understand her words, but he understood tears. "It is okay," he said softly. "You are safe now. I promise." The journey began under the midday sun, which showed no mercy to the Marines carrying stretchers through difficult terrain. Each stretcher required 2 men, which meant 8 of the 12-man patrol were occupied with transport duties, leaving only 4 to provide security. It was tactically unsound, dangerously exposed, and completely against their training. But they did it anyway. The path was rough, cutting through dense jungle, crossing streams, climbing over fallen trees and bomb craters. Every 100 yards presented a new obstacle. The Marines had to constantly adjust their grip, switch positions, coordinate their movements to keep the stretchers level and stable. Mitchell and Rodriguez carried Nakamura's stretcher. She lay rigid at first, terrified that any movement might anger her carriers, might make them remember she was the enemy and drop her. But as the minutes passed and the Americans continued their steady pace, speaking to each other in calm tones, even joking occasionally, some of her fear began to ease. "Water break," O'Brien called after the first mile. The Marines carefully set the stretchers down in the shade, and without being asked, they offered their canteens to the women before drinking themselves. This gesture struck Nakamura deeply. These soldiers, these young men who could have simply left them to die or worse, were giving up their own water in brutal heat to keep 4 enemy civilians alive. She tried to refuse the canteen Mitchell offered, gesturing that he should drink first. He smiled and shook his head, pressing it gently into her hands. "You first," he said. "You need it more." Tanaka, lying on the stretcher beside Nakamura's, watched this exchange with wonder. She turned to Yoshida and whispered in Japanese, "They share their water with us. In this heat, in enemy territory, they share their water." Yoshida nodded, equally amazed. Everything we were told was a lie. By the 3rd mile, the Marines were exhausted. Carrying a person on a makeshift stretcher through jungle terrain was brutally hard work. Their shoulders ached, their hands cramped, sweat poured down their faces and soaked through their uniforms. Several of them had blisters forming where the bamboo poles rubbed against their palms. But they did not complain. When one Marine's strength gave out, another immediately stepped in to take his place. They rotated positions, the men who had been on security taking turns with the stretchers, creating a rhythm that kept them moving forward. At one point, they had to cross a stream swollen by recent rains. The water was chest deep, the current strong enough to knock a man off his feet. O'Brien went first, testing the depth, finding the safest path. Then the Marines lifted the stretchers high, holding them above the water as they waded across. Nakamura, watching the water rush past below her, felt a surge of panic. If they dropped her, she would drown. She could not swim. But the Marines held firm, their arms trembling with effort but never wavering. Mitchell's face was set in concentration, every muscle in his body focused on keeping the stretcher level and safe. When they reached the other side, Mitchell grinned at her, breathing hard. "Made it," he said. "Told you we would not drop you." Nakamura did not understand his words, but she understood his smile. She smiled back, the first time she had smiled in weeks. The journey continued, miles passed slowly. The sun moved across the sky. Several times they heard artillery fire or the sound of aircraft, and each time O'Brien would call a halt, everyone freezing in place until the danger passed. During these tense moments, the Marines would position themselves protectively around the stretchers, using their own bodies as shields. This did not go unnoticed by the women. Tanaka, watching young Private Wilson crouch beside her stretcher during an artillery barrage, his body between her and the direction of the shells, felt something shift inside her. This boy, who looked young enough to be her grandson, was willing to die to protect her. The enemy. The monster they had been warned about was protecting her with his life. Around the 5th mile, they stopped for a longer rest. The Marines were clearly exhausted, and O'Brien knew he had to give them time to recover. They found a relatively safe spot, a small clearing surrounded by thick vegetation that provided both shade and concealment. Chen checked on Shimizu again. She had regained consciousness briefly, disoriented and weak. He gave her small sips of water mixed with a little sugar from their rations, trying to get some calories into her system. She looked up at him with confused eyes, unable to comprehend why this American soldier was being so gentle with her. "You are going to be okay," Chen told her, knowing she could not understand but needing to say it anyway. "We are getting you to help." Private Davis had broken out the rations, and the Marines were eating quickly, refueling for the hard miles ahead. Mitchell looked at his K-ration, then at Nakamura lying on the stretcher nearby. She was watching the Americans eat with an expression he recognized. Hunger. Deep, desperate hunger. Without thinking about it, Mitchell opened his ration pack and walked over to Nakamura. He broke off half of his chocolate bar and offered it to her. Nakamura stared at the chocolate. She had not eaten chocolate in years. Before the war, it had been a rare treat, something special for festivals or celebrations. Now this American soldier, who should have been her enemy, who should have left her to die or killed her himself, was offering her half his food. She took the chocolate with shaking hands. The first taste exploded on her tongue, sweet and rich and utterly overwhelming. Tears streamed down her face as she ate, each bite a reminder of a world before war, before hunger, before fear. Around the clearing, other Marines were doing the same thing. Wilson gave Yoshida half his crackers. Rodriguez shared his canned fruit with Tanaka. They gave away food they needed, calories they would miss during the hard miles ahead because they could not stand to watch these old women starve. O'Brien watched his men sharing their rations and felt a fierce pride. These boys, these young men who had been taught to hate, who had every reason to leave these civilians behind, were choosing compassion instead. They were choosing to be better than the war had tried to make them. "All right, let us move out," O'Brien said after 15 minutes. "We still have 7 miles to go." The second half of the journey was harder than the first. The terrain grew rougher, the path less certain. They were moving through areas that might still have enemy soldiers, areas that could be mined or booby-trapped. Every step required caution, every shadow could hide danger. At mile 7, Davis on point suddenly raised his fist, signaling danger. Everyone froze. In the silence, they could hear voices ahead. Japanese voices. O'Brien moved up beside Davis, peering through the vegetation. A small group of Japanese soldiers, maybe 5 or 6, were moving along a parallel path about 50 yards away. They had not seen the Marine patrol yet, but they were heading in a direction that might bring them across the Americans' path. O'Brien faced an impossible choice. They could engage the enemy soldiers, but that would mean a firefight with 4 helpless civilians in the middle of it. They could try to hide and wait for the Japanese to pass, but the stretchers made concealment difficult. Or they could try to move away quietly, but any noise might give away their position. On the stretchers, the women had heard the Japanese voices too. Nakamura's heart pounded. If those soldiers found them with the Americans, they might think the women were collaborators, traitors. Japanese military law was harsh with civilians who aided the enemy, even under duress. O'Brien made his decision quickly. He gestured for everyone to move back slowly, retreating into thicker cover. The Marines lifted the stretchers with exaggerated care, each step measured and silent. They were good at this. Weeks of combat had taught them how to move without sound, how to blend into terrain, how to disappear. They retreated about 30 yards, then crouched in a dense thicket, barely breathing, weapons ready. The Japanese soldiers' voices grew louder as they approached, then gradually faded as they continued past, never knowing how close they had come to an encounter. When the voices were finally gone, O'Brien waited 5 more minutes before giving the signal to move. As they lifted the stretchers again, Nakamura caught O'Brien's eye. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of thanks. O'Brien nodded back, understanding crossing the language barrier. The near encounter had shaken everyone. The Marines moved more cautiously now, more alert, but they also seemed more determined. They had come this far. They were not going to fail these women now. As the journey continued, the 4 women found themselves struggling with something more difficult than physical pain. Their entire understanding of reality was crumbling. Nakamura lay on her stretcher, watching the back of Mitchell's head as he carried her. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His shoulders shook with exhaustion. Blisters must be forming on his hands from the bamboo poles. And he was doing all of this for her, a stranger, an enemy, an old woman who contributed nothing to his mission and potentially endangered it. Why? The question tormented her. Everything she had been told, everything she had believed about Americans, said this could not happen. They were supposed to be devils, beasts without honor or mercy. The government had been clear. Military broadcasts had been specific. Surrender meant torture and death. Yet here she was, being carried to safety by young Americans who treated her with more kindness than she had received from her own military. Japanese soldiers had passed through her village, had taken all the food, had conscripted young men and boys, had left the elderly and weak to fend for themselves. The Americans she had been taught to fear as monsters were the ones showing compassion. The cognitive dissonance was painful. If this was true, if the Americans were not monsters, then what did that say about everything else? What did it say about the war? About the sacrifices demanded? About the children who had been taught to die rather than surrender? Tanaka was wrestling with similar thoughts. She clutched her granddaughter's photograph, thinking about the little girl who had been evacuated to the countryside, who had been told terrible stories about the American demons who would eat Japanese children if they ever landed on the sacred islands. Her granddaughter was only 6 years old, terrified, living with strangers, believing monsters were coming. And the monsters had come. But they were not monsters at all. They were boys, tired and scared and far from home, who still found it in themselves to show mercy. What would she tell her granddaughter now? How could she explain that everything they had been taught was a lie? The Marines were experiencing their own transformation, though perhaps less dramatically. They had been taught that Japanese civilians were fanatics who would never surrender, who would fight to the death or commit suicide rather than accept capture. They had been warned about booby-trapped children, about civilians hiding grenades, about the impossibility of distinguishing friend from foe. But these 4 women were not fanatics. They were just scared old ladies who wanted to survive. Mitchell, carrying Nakamura, found himself thinking about his grandmother back in Iowa, who used to bake him cookies and tell him stories about the old country. This woman on his stretcher was somebody's grandmother, too. "My arms are killing me," Rodriguez muttered during a brief rest, flexing his cramping hands. "Mine too," Mitchell agreed, "but we are more than halfway now. We can make it." Wilson looked at Yoshida, who was watching them with an expression of grateful confusion. "Do you think they understand why we are doing this?" "Probably not," Chen said. "Hell, I am not sure I fully understand it myself. We were supposed to be scouting enemy positions. Instead, we are running a medevac for civilians who probably think we are going to kill them. We are doing it because it is the right thing to do," O'Brien said firmly. "Because the war does not get to take our humanity away. Because we are better than the propaganda says we are. On both sides." His words hung in the air and the Marines nodded slowly. They were tired, sore, potentially in danger. But they were also proud. This was who they wanted to be. Soldiers who protected the helpless, even when the helpless wore the face of the enemy. Around mile 9, they stopped for another rest. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the jungle. They had been walking for hours, and both carriers and carried were exhausted beyond anything they had experienced before. Mitchell sat down heavily beside Nakamura's stretcher, his head in his hands. His shoulders were on fire, his back screaming. He had never been so tired in his life. Beside him, Nakamura struggled to sit up, gesturing toward a canteen. Mitchell handed her the canteen, but instead of drinking, Nakamura gestured for him to drink first. It was a small thing, but it struck Mitchell deeply. This woman, who had every reason to take what she could get, was offering kindness in return. He took a small drink, then handed the canteen back. Nakamura drank, then offered it back again. They passed it back and forth, sharing water in a gesture that felt almost ceremonial. Nakamura reached into her kimono and pulled out a small object. It was a rice ball, wrapped in leaves, probably the last food she had. It was small, probably spoiled, definitely not enough to sustain anyone. But it was what she had to offer. She held it out to Mitchell with both hands, bowing her head. Mitchell understood what she was doing. This was not just food. This was a gift, a gesture of thanks, an acknowledgement that she understood he was helping her. He took the rice ball carefully, bowed his head in return, then broke it in half and gave half back to her. They ate together, enemy soldier and enemy civilian, sharing the last scraps of food, connected by simple humanity that war could not erase. Around them, similar moments were playing out. Wilson was showing Yoshida a photograph of his mother. Rodriguez was trying to teach Tanaka how to say "thank you" in English, both of them laughing at his terrible pronunciation of Japanese. Chen was carefully adjusting Shimizu's blanket, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. These were not Americans and Japanese. These were just human beings, taking care of each other in impossible circumstances. The last 3 miles were the hardest. Everyone was running on fumes. The Marines' steps were mechanical, their bodies moving more from will than strength. The women lay on the stretchers in a haze of exhaustion and confusion, barely conscious but aware that these Americans were still carrying them, still protecting them, still refusing to give up. O'Brien kept them moving with quiet encouragement. 2 more miles. We can do 2 more miles, 1 foot in front of the other. The path grew steeper, climbing a ridge that seemed to go on forever. Mitchell's legs were trembling, threatening to give out. Behind him, Rodriguez was breathing in harsh gasps, but they kept going, kept lifting 1 foot, then the other, kept the stretchers level and steady. Finally, as the sun touched the horizon, Davis on point raised his hand. "I see it," he called back. "The aid station, 1/2 mile." A wave of relief swept through the patrol. They had made it. 12 miles through enemy territory, carrying 4 civilians, and they had made it. The final 1/2 mile passed in a blur. The aid station came into view, a collection of tents surrounded by sandbags, the Red Cross flag visible even in the fading light. Medical personnel saw them coming and rushed out to meet them. "We have 4 civilians," O'Brien reported to the doctor who came running. "Severe dehydration, malnutrition, possible other conditions. One is critical." The medical team took over immediately, professional and efficient. Shimizu was rushed into the main treatment tent. Nurses helped the other 3 women off their stretchers, speaking to them in soothing tones even though the words meant nothing. As they were being led away, Nakamura turned back, her eyes seeking out Mitchell. When she found him, she bowed deeply, tears streaming down her face. No words were needed. The gesture said everything. Mitchell bowed back, equally moved. Inside the aid station, the women received treatment that probably saved their lives. Shimizu was given intravenous fluids, antibiotics for the infection that had been developing, and careful monitoring. The doctor told O'Brien later that another day, maybe even another few hours, and she would have been beyond saving. The other 3 women were in better shape, but still critically ill. They received fluids, food introduced gradually to avoid shocking their systems, clean clothes, and real beds. It was more care than they had received in months, more kindness than they had expected to ever see again. For Nakamura, lying in a real bed for the first time in weeks, the experience was overwhelming. American doctors and nurses moved around her with efficient compassion, treating her with the same care they gave their own wounded soldiers. An interpreter had been found, a Japanese-American soldier who could translate. Through the interpreter, Nakamura asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Why did they save us? Why did those soldiers risk themselves for enemy civilians? The interpreter relayed the question to the doctor, who smiled sadly. "Because that is who we are supposed to be," he said. "Because even in war, we do not lose our humanity. Because you are human beings who needed help, and we had the ability to give it." When the interpreter translated this, Nakamura began to cry again. These were not tears of fear or relief, but of understanding. Everything she had been taught, every warning she had received, every story of American cruelty had been lies. The enemy was not the monster. The enemy was just people, capable of the same kindness and cruelty as anyone else. While the women were being treated, O'Brien and his patrol had their own reckoning to face. They had been gone far longer than planned. They had failed to complete their scouting mission. They had potentially endangered themselves and their mission for the sake of 4 enemy civilians. Captain Reynolds, their commanding officer, was waiting when they arrived. He listened to O'Brien's report with an unreadable expression, then dismissed the patrol to get food and rest. He kept O'Brien behind. "Sergeant," Reynolds began, and O'Brien prepared himself for the reprimand he knew was coming. "You directly disobeyed your orders. You failed to complete your mission. You put your men at risk for—" He paused, shaking his head. "For 4 old women who are probably enemy civilians." "Yes, sir," O'Brien said. "I take full responsibility. The decision was mine." Reynolds looked at him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. "The doctor tells me one of those women would have died without immediate treatment. Another day and she would have been gone." "Yes, sir," O'Brien repeated, unsure where this was going. "So you and your men carried 4 dying civilians 12 miles through enemy territory, risking your lives and your mission to save people who should be your enemies." Reynolds' smile widened. "That is exactly the kind of Marines I want under my command." "Well done, Sergeant. Now get some rest, and next time try to complete your actual mission, too." O'Brien stared in surprise. "Sir?" "We are not the monsters, Sergeant," Reynolds said quietly. "We never were. And we prove that every time we choose mercy over cruelty, humanity over hate. Now go take care of your men. They earned it." Over the next few days, the 4 women recovered slowly. Shimizu regained full consciousness and began the long process of rebuilding her strength. The others improved daily, their bodies responding to proper food, clean water, and medical care. The Marines visited when they could. Mitchell brought Nakamura books, even though she could not read English. Wilson shared photographs of his family with Yoshida. Chen taught Tanaka simple English phrases. These visits were awkward, stumbling affairs, full of gestures and smiles and attempts at communication that often failed but somehow still succeeded. Through the interpreter, the women learned more about the men who had saved them. Mitchell had a farm waiting for him in Iowa. Wilson wanted to be a teacher. Rodriguez had 3 younger siblings who he missed terribly. Chen's parents had fled China to escape Japanese occupation and had struggled to make a life in America. That last revelation was particularly striking to the women. Chen's family had suffered because of the Japanese military, had every reason to hate Japanese people. Yet he had still helped carry them to safety without hesitation. The irony was not lost on anyone. The women also shared their stories. Nakamura had been a rice farmer, a widow who had lost her husband to illness years before the war. Tanaka had run a small shop in her village, selling fabric and thread. Yoshida had been a midwife, had helped bring dozens of babies into the world. Shimizu had taught at the village school. They were ordinary women who had lived ordinary lives until war had stolen everything. And now, in the strangest twist of fate, they had been saved by the people they had been taught to fear most. After 2 weeks of recovery, the women were well enough to be transferred to a civilian internment camp where they could be reunited with other refugees. The day of their departure, all 12 Marines came to see them off, even though some had to get permission to leave their posts. The goodbye was emotional for everyone. Nakamura had become particularly close to Mitchell, despite the language barrier. Through the interpreter, she told him, "You gave me back my life. More than that, you gave me back my faith that goodness exists in this world. I will never forget you. My children, my grandchildren, will know your name and what you did." Mitchell, tough farm boy from Iowa who had fought through some of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, had tears running down his face. "You take care of yourself," he told her. "The war will end someday. When it does, I hope you get back to your village, back to your family." Tanaka gave Wilson her granddaughter's photograph. "Keep this," she said through the interpreter. "Remember that this little girl exists because of your kindness. When you go home, when you have your own children, show them this picture. Tell them about the day you helped an old woman who should have been your enemy." Wilson accepted the photograph with shaking hands, promising to treasure it. Yoshida and Shimizu said their own goodbyes, equally tearful, equally profound. Then the women were helped into a truck, and the Marines stood at attention as they drove away, saluting 4 old women who had taught them something important about war and humanity. For the Marines who had carried those 4 women 12 miles, the experience changed something fundamental. They continued to fight, continued to follow orders, continued to do their duty as soldiers. But they never forgot that day. Never forgot those 4 faces, never forgot what it felt like to choose mercy in the middle of war. Mitchell survived the war and returned to his farm in Iowa. He kept Nakamura's small gift, a silk handkerchief she had given him, in a special box his entire life. He told the story to his children, his grandchildren, anyone who would listen. He wanted them to understand that even in the worst circumstances, humans could choose to be kind. Wilson became a teacher as he had dreamed. The photograph of Tanaka's granddaughter sat on his desk for 40 years. He used it in his lessons, asking students to think about the human cost of war, about the power of choosing compassion. Rodriguez went home to his family, but he carried the memory of that 12-mile journey with him always. Years later, when his own son was drafted during Vietnam, Rodriguez told him the story. "Remember that the enemy is human too," he said. "Never let the war take your humanity." Chen's story was perhaps the most poignant. His family had suffered under Japanese occupation. He had every personal reason to hate, but he had still helped carry those women to safety. He never regretted it. "Hatred is easy," he would say later. "Forgiveness is hard, but forgiveness is what makes us human." Sergeant O'Brien went on to have a distinguished military career, but when asked about his proudest moment as a Marine, he never mentioned battles won or medals earned. He talked about 4 old women and 12 miles through the jungle. "That was the day I knew we were the good guys," he said, "not because of what we destroyed, but because of what we saved." The 4 women survived the war. They were reunited with surviving family members in the months after Japan's surrender. Their villages were gone, their old lives impossible to reclaim. They, like millions of others, had to build new lives from the ruins. Nakamura lived to be 94 years old. She never forgot the young American who had carried her to safety. She told the story so often that her grandchildren could recite it by heart. In her final years, when her mind began to fade, she would sometimes wake confused, asking if Mitchell had come to visit. Tanaka was reunited with her granddaughter who had survived the war. She raised the girl with a lesson that contradicted everything the war had taught. "The Americans are not monsters," she told her. "Some of them are very kind. Never forget that people are individuals, not just members of a group." Yoshida returned to her work as a midwife, helping to deliver a new generation of Japanese children into a world trying to recover from war. She named several babies Mitchell, Wilson, and Chen, honoring the men who had saved her. The parents never understood why she suggested these American names, and she never fully explained, but she smiled each time one was accepted. Shimizu, who had been closest to death that day in the jungle, lived another 30 years. She became a teacher again, and in her classroom hung a photograph, faded and worn, of 12 young American Marines. She never told her students the full story, but when they asked about the photograph, she would say simply, "They saved my life when they could have left me to die. Remember that humanity can shine even in the darkest times." The story of those 4 women and 12 Marines never made headlines. There were no medals awarded, no official recognition, no place in the history books. It was just one small moment of compassion in a war filled with cruelty. One choice to save rather than destroy, to protect rather than kill. But the ripples from that choice spread wider than anyone could have imagined. The Marines told the story, the women told the story, their children told it, their grandchildren. Each retelling was a reminder that even in war, humans can choose to be human. The story challenged narratives on both sides. For Americans, it was proof that their cause was just, that they were the good guys not because of what they destroyed, but because of what they preserved. For Japanese, it was evidence that the propaganda had been lies, that the enemy was not the demon they had been warned about. More importantly, it was a reminder that war does not have to strip away our humanity, that we can fight when necessary and still choose mercy when possible, that the enemy is human, complex, capable of suffering just like us. that compassion is not weakness but the highest form of strength. And so 12 miles through the jungle became more than just a journey. It became a testament to what humans can be when they refuse to let war take their souls. For 4 elderly Japanese women who expected to die, those 12 miles meant life. For 12 young American Marines who could have walked away, those 12 miles meant becoming something better than soldiers. They became saviors. The miracle was not that they carried 4 women 12 miles. The miracle was that in the middle of one of the bloodiest wars in human history, on an island torn apart by violence, 12 young men looked at 4 helpless civilians and saw not enemies but human beings worth saving. This is the story we need to remember, not to glorify war, but to remember that even in war's darkest moments, humanity survives. That mercy is always a choice, and choosing mercy does not make you weak. It makes you human. Nakamura lived long enough to see former enemies become allies, to see Japan and America build a friendship on the ruins of war. She saw the miracle not just in her own survival, but in the reconciliation that followed. She saw what is possible when humans remember that those on the other side are humans too. On her deathbed at 94 years old, Nakamura's last words were in English, a language she had learned laboriously in the years after the war. "Thank you, Mitchell," she said. "Thank you for showing me that goodness exists." Mitchell had died 10 years earlier, but his family was contacted. They told Nakamura's family that Mitchell's last wish had been for his story to be shared, for people to understand that war does not have to make us monsters. So here is that story. 4 grandmothers who were left to die. 12 soldiers who refused to let that happen. 12 miles that became a bridge between enemies. A reminder that mercy is always possible, always meaningful, always worth choosing. The stretchers made from bamboo and jackets are long gone. The path through that jungle has been reclaimed by nature. The war ended 79 years ago, but the lesson remains. Humanity persists even in inhumane circumstances. Compassion survives even in war's darkest corners. And sometimes the most important battles are not fought with weapons, but with the simple, radical choice to see the enemy as human and to treat them accordingly. That is the story worth remembering. That is the lesson that matters. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of human compassion, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories from World War II are not just history. They are lessons about who we can choose to be, even in the worst circumstances. Share this story. Let it remind others that mercy is always an option and choosing mercy is always the right choice. Thank you for watching. Remember these 12 Marines? Remember these 4 grandmothers? Remember that humanity is stronger than hate.